Good evening. I'm Gwynne Lee with the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, Kansas. Welcome to Let's Talk Issues, a public service program co-sponsored by the Johnson County Community College, the Kansas City Star, and the League of Women Voters. Tonight's topic is taking the temperature of the area economy. Here to introduce tonight's panelist is Kevin Collison with the Kansas City Star. Thank you for joining us, and now let's talk issues.
Thanks, Gwynne. I'd like to introduce our panel tonight. Across from me is Bill Black, a professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City in economics and law. Seated next to him is Paul Welcome, the Johnson County Appraiser. Next to Paul is Doug Davidson of the County Economic Research Institute. He's the president. And then next to Doug is Jeff Pinkerton, an economist with the Mid-America Regional Council. And again, I'm Kevin Collison. I'm the development reporter at the Kansas City Star. To start off, gentlemen, just wanted to have a jump ball question. If everybody just wants to give their impression of the overall economic health of the metropolitan area at this point in time. Go ahead.
Very weak historically, better than many parts of the nation. Parts of the metropolitan area still incredibly strong relative to the Great Recession.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Areas are seeing a lot of slow growth that we're having in the past. We are nowhere near the two coastlines as far as the economic recession that is going on. Actually, we're doing fairly well in Johnson County as far as employment, but of course we need more jobs.
Doug?
I would echo those sentiments as well. The metro is doing better than many metropolitan areas around the nation. Johnson County, while we're at performing historically worse than we are used to, we're still better off than most communities. I think we're better off in Johnson County than the rest of the metropolitan area as a whole, generally speaking.
You were mentioning before we started the unemployment rate in Johnson County. Maybe you can just throw that out as a comparison to what's going on in the rest of the metro and the country.
Well, in December, which is the latest data we have, we were at 6%. For the year last year, we averaged 6.3%. But 6% is historically high for Johnson County. Yet we're much better off than the nation as a whole. Or even the Kansas City metropolitan area. Kansas City Metro was 8.6% in December, and the nation is near 10%.
Mm-hmm. Jeff?
Well, I'll take this rare opportunity to be more optimistic about the economy than we've heard. It's very important to note that we've gone through a real bad recession, but we weathered that recession much better than the nation did. We didn't have the housing problems that the rest of the country did, where housing values escalated and then dropped dramatically. So we're going to we have skirted most of the problems that the nation has seen, and we think we're looking at a very modest recovery this year in 2010 of somewhere around 2.5%, excuse me, with the nation growing probably around 2%. So we think we're back on track to outpacing the nation. Mm-hmm. Granted, it's a very low growth rate, but I think we're at least on the cusp of getting back to where we have been, and we're outpacing the nation. So a little bit of a positive spin to that.
Let's drill down a little bit. The economy is such a huge word. Let's talk about some different sectors of the economy. What are some of the stronger sectors from what your impression is in the area versus some of the weaker ones, and perhaps a little explanation of what's going on there?
Okay. Well, really we're looking at employment. That's the big story right now. Where are we seeing employment growth occur? Well, right, in the past couple of years, it's only been in government sector. Unfortunately, that's the only sector that's been hiring. A lot of that here locally is public elementary schools and the like. But in addition to that, health is an expanding industry, and that's been growing here. And also, we've been keeping an eye on professional scientific technology jobs in the region. While they're not really growing in the last couple of years, they still aren't declining as much as they have been in the nation. So we think that's something that we've maybe are coming in on an area that these are high-paying jobs, real good growth jobs that beget other jobs in the region, and we're doing a fairly good job in those areas. So I would say healthcare and technical science, technical services are areas that we're doing pretty well in.
Any different wrinkles on that in Johnson County as opposed to the rest of the metro, as far as which sectors of the Johnson County economy are doing better than others?
I don't know, Doug, you can.
Well, I think with regard to the industry mix, in terms of which industries are doing well, we pretty much reflect what Jeff said. I think, as he said, healthcare, technical services, engineering, those sorts of things have been pretty resilient.
Call, any thoughts on that?
On the real estate side, we're seeing our lowest new construction activity that we've seen in the 2 decades that I've been here. And since about 2005, we've been on a steady decline as far as residential construction. We used to build always 3,000 to 4,500 homes for 15 years, and then this past year we built about 650. So that's a dramatic drop over the last 4 years that we have seen a steadily decline in our construction market. Again, that has to deal with net growth of population. With population, then you can have then new construction going on with residential units. So I think that's an area that, for Johnson County, is a weak area for us, and hopefully it'll start turning around.
I've also noticed through my own reporting that the development industry has slowed down tremendously. A lot of the retail office projects, Johnson County always has been kind of a major powerhouse as far as retail development, and we've got some stalled projects. I know Corbin Park at 135th and Metcalf is in bankruptcy. A couple of projects at Lenexa City Center have declared bankruptcy. Do you see that as being a reflection of the recession or the problems with the housing market?
Well, actually, I think it has to deal with the disposable income that most people have. And we actually calculate on a per square foot basis what the gross retail sales are for Johnson County, and we're looking at about $228 a square foot. That's very similar to what it was back in 2003. It went up and then now has come back down in the last 4 years.
What was the peak?
The peak was actually last year, but we think it's an aberration because of the sprint moving from sales and use to sales tax calculations. But if you take that aberration out, the peak was, say, was 240, and now we're down to 228, and that's due to net growth of the amount of retail space we have. The area that we had one project that was 1 million square feet in the warehouse area, but if you take that out, all of our areas are actually down as far as new construction growth.
Bill, do you got any particular sectors you think are doing better than others?
Well, I'll pick up on the positives, but with a little more explanation. It's ironic, there's huge hostility in parts of this area to government, but it's saved our bacon in terms of the local economy, and there's no question about it. People forget this is a huge governmental metropolitan area. And those are high-paying jobs and more stable jobs. So that's why that sector has been so critical. In health, we are positioned to be superb, but the major risk factor is the Kansas legislature in terms of its hostility to many things involving the cutting-edge aspects of health. And so we have lost major opportunities to the coasts. So at best, we're just sort of hanging there. And these are superb jobs in terms of income levels and what they add to a community and add to the quality of life. In terms of the disadvantages, there are two really bad areas. As we noted, housing was less of a problem here than in many places in the country. But commercial real estate is the second big shoe that has fallen. There's an enormous glut. And we have to compete, and Overland Park in particular has to compete with places that don't need to be in the Kansas City area, or may decide 2 years from now they don't need to be. And they can go to Atlanta, where rents are collapsing. So we have to look at that as a danger. This is a headquarters town in many places, right? Office space, that's what is going to be hurt. And the second thing, related to what you were raising, we have an enormous problem with financial institutions. We have less of a problem than many parts of the nation, but the FDIC has just said that there are 3,000 banks that are in enormous trouble because of over-concentration on commercial real estate. And so in many ways, we're lucky that we didn't create more of a glut there, and we already do have a glut. So if we add to capacity right now in commercial real estate, you're going to see rents falling further. And rents are already under the table. Deals are already rife in this sector that don't necessarily show up publicly.
What about, obviously, if you're in Johnson County, you can't help but not talk a little bit about Sprint. How's that been affecting the Johnson County economy? I was frankly surprised. We had a story in the paper the other day that said the employment at Sprint has dropped to 7,400. And a few years ago it was 14,000. What has the ripple effects been in Johnson County, and how much, if anything, has that got to do with the recession that we've just gotten through?
Well, Sprint's very important to the regional economy and particularly to Johnson County. And certainly their reduction in employment has been felt here. And really I think it's exacerbated the overall effects of the recession. I think their reduction in employment is more a function of their competition within their industry and not so much a result of the recession that we find ourselves in now. In fact, their reduction in employment started really prior to the beginning of the recession. But certainly we felt it. Of course, we've also benefited tremendously from them consolidating their headquarters here in Johnson County over the years.
That's a good point.
And so
right.
it's you know, I like to think of it as a glass half full proposition rather than half empty.
Just any evidence that some of the folks that have left the company, formed their own companies, or has created any new economic activity in Johnson County?
Well, I think there is. I don't have specific examples, but you do hear anecdotal information about that, and there probably are other people in the community who are much more familiar with that. But certainly there are other examples, not other than Sprint. Look at Garmin. I mean, Garmin was started by a couple of fellows here locally who were with Allied Signal and had an idea and wanted to move forward with it, and that was the beginning of Garmin. So,
and they've been growing fairly steadily.
They have, and in fact, I understand that they're adding employment currently.
Oh.
But one of the things with Sprint Campus is that we've had large blocks of office space that we're able to then attract new businesses into our area. And we've had two major companies, I think, that have already indicated that they're moving into the Sprint campus. So, you know, it's one of those things that, you know, the shrinking of Sprint, but there's also a side benefit that we've had a large 100,000 square foot blocks of buildings ready to be rented that are now being occupied, or will be occupied very soon.
Well, on the flip side of that, though, I hear it could be a real devastating effect in the local office market, in which private companies that have office buildings, not only in Johnson County, but in the city of Kansas City and the metro, now are being forced to compete with this large campus, and many of them believe they're being undercut on the prices on that. And actually, one realtor raised an interesting question to me: how is Overland Park going to react the first time a company that's in an Overland Park office building wants to relocate into the Sprint campus? Do you see some disruptions in the values of local real estate because of the vacancies at Sprint?
Well, I think vacancy overall, and what Bill was talking about, was we're seeing that there's a softening of rents, and we're also seeing that there's higher vacancies that are out there. And the question is, how fast will we be able to start absorbing that? And there are a competitive set, but they're also looking at large blocks of people moving in. They're not wanting to split their campus so much up. They're wanting to, you know, you take the building type of concept.
Right, that was the deal.
And so you got to deal with a very large person moving in or a company moving in versus more of the smaller office complexes.
That tends to be a national market.
Yes.
And that's where the rent concessions that don't show up in the official numbers, you know, where you get a lower rental rate, where you don't pay for 6 months, for a year, where tenant improvements suddenly get paid for by the landlord to a massively greater extent than normal. All the things we saw in Texas in prior crises are going to be happening as well if the national market for commercial real estate continues to go the way everybody thinks it's going, which is deeply south really quick.
Do we, just to kind of wrap up a little bit about taking the temperature of the metro health, we've talked a lot about Johnson County, obviously that's our prime audience. Any other observations from the folks familiar with the overall metro about which counties may be in particularly difficult straits right now as far as unemployment and as far as key factors of their employment base being in worse shape than perhaps some of the other parts of the metro?
Well, I think we've always said our economy is very diverse, and I really think when you look at the individual counties in the area, really they're pretty diverse as well. A lot of people will look at, we do have some automobile plants here in the metro area, and the auto manufacturing has really taken some hits nationwide. But you look at our two plants, Fairfax is doing very well. They added a shift. I believe last summer we were worried about them cutting back to half, and the news we got was they added a shift. Fairfax doing well. Claycomo still doing well with the Ford production up there. So even the industry that is not doing very well, manufacturing, we are losing manufacturing jobs in this region. That's true, but we are not losing them at the same rate as the nation. We're gaining share in manufacturing. So I think that is doing well. I think when you look at the big picture here is when are the jobs going to start coming back to this region, and that's going to be really the driving factor. And I don't know if there's one region. Johnson County has clearly been the job creation leader in the region, and I think it will continue to do so in years to come.
Do you have any, just to wrap up, because I've always been fascinated with the fact that we've been so fortunate with the auto industry here in Kansas City compared to other parts of the country. Any idea how large a percentage of our local economy is generated by those auto plants and their suppliers?
Boy, I'd have to go back and crunch some numbers. I wouldn't have those off the top of my head.
It's actually a fairly small percentage.
Right. Well, manufacturing in total is about 13% of our workforce. So
you're talking more in the 1%, maybe 1.5% range, I think, for the auto.
Specific to auto, yeah, that may very well be.
That includes the ripple effect of the suppliers and all the people who.
Well, that gets into the never land of how you attribute things, but 1.5 is not a tiny thing. I think all of us would stress, and those again tend to be better paying jobs, and they attract other businesses. You need that manufacturing for a whole host of other types of businesses, which is what you were getting at. So the fact that it's a small percentage doesn't mean unimportant.
Right. I think some of the numbers that you're talking about, the multiplier effect that a lot of people like to throw out, the model that we use looks at manufacturing employment multiplier at 5, or near 5. So every one manufacturing job in automobiles, there's 5 other jobs out there supporting that one job. So it really is an important industry.
And you have to think strategically about the future. If you lose in the high-tech sphere, and Sprint net is a big loss, and it isn't due to this crisis, it's due to managerial decisions, frankly, at Sprint that didn't pan out very well. That has put a crimp into this area's ability to compete in high tech, because there are big multiplier effects and there are entrepreneurial effects, which is what you were getting at. Once you have a really vibrant technical sector, it feeds on itself and becomes a positive. Conversely, we haven't talked much about, there are really poor people, and underemployment is in 20% range in many parts of this metropolitan area. Johnson County can't continue to be a big success if that drag occurs, and it's a pure waste of American assets to have massive numbers of people who want to work not working.
Right. Is that recession related, or has that been a structural problem in the local economy, and is there any way you can tell the difference?
You can try, and we try in economic studies to distinguish between the two. It's both. is the answer. It's been a long-term structural problem. It's gotten much worse because of this recession, and it has the capacity to get worse. Again, if you think strategically, you want high tech, you want medical facilities and such. We've got really good folks there, but we also have a completely dysfunctional public school system in Kansas City, which shows up invisibly, right, as the resources that aren't there. The tens of thousands of people that should be highly skilled workers drawing people to this general area who are not there because of the failed system. So again, if you think strategically, you've got to think more broadly than Johnson County.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit then about looking forward. Now, I know a couple of you guys have some optimism about 2010. Are there some, we love to use this metaphor, green shoots of promise in the local economy that indicates we're starting to revive? And if so, any ideas how long it may take before we get back to where we were before the recession hit us a couple of years ago?
Well, we think when we look at our economic forecast, break out the crystal ball and see where we think we're going, we think 2010 is going to be a rather lackluster year, but we think 2011 is when we're getting back to the 3-4% growth rates. Now, there are a lot of unknowns out there. You mentioned the commercial real estate issue. If that wave hits with the serious impact as people think, that certainly can change we have the right to change that forecast when such things happen, and we do. But we think all things, going as they are, we think we're on the right track. It's just going to be very slow. The recovery is going to be dragged down by the joblessness of this. I mean, we're just not adding jobs. Businesses are reluctant to bring on more folks until they're sure that this economy's got traction and we're going forward.
What do you think as far as just some signs of recovery, if there are any out there, and when we may get back to where we were a couple of years ago?
Well, we're seeing, of course, at the local level, the Johnson County level, a lot of the economic data lags what we get at the national level. The national data always comes out first. But nationally, we're seeing job losses slow down.
Right.
And so, at some point we will start to add jobs again. We think that'll happen later this year, as Jeff mentioned. But here locally, some of this data that we do track, that we are able to get locally, in the residential real estate market, for example, we were down last year overall, but we did see some signs in the fourth quarter of stabilization in home sales, and in fact a little bit of an upturn as compared to 2008. Of course, 2008 was not a good year to compare against. It was not a good year, but we are seeing a little bit of an uptick there. I think that some of that is probably driven by the tax incentives, the tax credits that have been made available for home, and also for move up. But that hopefully is we've created a floor there, and from there we'll start to tick up.
Any particular areas where you think hiring may start resuming before others? I mean, if you were trying to project just based on lagging indicators, et cetera, where do you think that some of the sectors are where the hiring is going to start resuming soon?
Well, Bill may have some insight on this as well, but in Johnson County we've got some pretty powerful things going for us. We're one of the most highly educated populations in the nation, and so we have a very highly educated workforce, and which is I think going to be, has been historically, and I think will continue to be an attraction to employers. We have a great workforce here in Johnson County. So and then with things like Bill mentioned, high tech employment, KU Hospital, University of Kansas building the cancer research facilities, and K-State building their bioscience campus in Olathe. That's really advancing us into an area of technology that we haven't had as much concentration in before, and is likely to be a high growth sector in the future.
And do you think Johnson County's position, I know I always hear this a lot in the city, and I'm not, you've got a lot of great research, but the trick is to take the research and translate it into job-producing products. And that requires a lot of, I guess, angel, what's the right word?
Capital.
Venture capital. What do you think? Are we positioned to take advantage of all the research after the public investments are made by creating jobs and new companies?
Well, that's the K-State Bioscience Campus. That's one of their focuses, is on transferring that technology from academia into the private sector. Their plan is to develop and disseminate that and actually build a private industry research park around the university on that campus. And then there are, as far as funding, venture capital goes, there are various venture capital networks in the region that are in place and ready to go.
Any idea of the scale of jobs we're talking about? Are we talking about 100 PhDs or a couple of thousand jobs of all types of different training levels, from production people to researchers?
Well, undoubtedly there will be jobs at all those levels. As far as numbers, I don't have those off the top of my head.
I would just add, you talked about the venture capital. It's a big issue for us because we get, in states Missouri and Kansas, a fraction of what they're getting in the coast. But I have had people say that if you go ahead and develop that niche, if we're going to be a life sciences leader, and we have the universities, most importantly, the universities that are producing those PhDs, those people in those fields, that venture capital will flow and follow those and find those students. So I think the most important thing we're doing is, like K-State, investing in life science research here in the metro area. Excellent KCADC, the Area Development Council, works very diligently on life sciences and works with all the different universities in the area, from Columbia to Manhattan, Iowa State down to Oklahoma State, I think, and really puts Kansas City in the middle of that corridor, making sure we are a life science, particularly animal health, leader. So I think that capital will start to flow into the area because the universities producing those PhDs are here.
Paul, it's spring. Are you smelling any scent of recovery, and what areas are you seeing potential that we're stirring from the winter's nap of our recession?
I think the real key is jobs. And if we get jobs starting to, then real estate will rebound. So our key is people moving in. The announcements of the 100,000 square foot blocks being occupied and people moving into the Johnson County metro area. I think that's really a key for us, and that's what's going to start the rebound on recovery in the real estate market. Once those are in place, and then we can start getting them moving, then hopefully some of the commercial properties will start rebounding versus still falling. As you would say, we're in a difficult time period, like we saw back in the 80s, and we were both from Texas area, and we were talking about that, and the Austin and RTC when we had those issues back in.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that you just went through a reappraisal in Johnson County, and that's probably about as firm a temperature-taking mechanism I can think. What did you guys? What happened?
On the commercial side, values for existing properties went down about 10%. That's an average. That's a big drop in 1 year from and we do annual reappraisal, and the year before we did about 7% drop. So if you take the two, we're close to an 18% drop in value in commercial values from, let's say, the peak. Residentially, we saw a negative drop of about 2.5% on existing property. But it was interesting in that the lower price range actually saw a positive increase, whereas once you get beyond the 150,000 and moving up in increments, there was the higher the value, the greater the drop in value. So,
any theory why?
Well, I think part of it is the 85 and 6,500, the two tax credits that are out there. I think it's really also Johnson County is a very desirable place to live, and if you're in that marketplace, then that's also a good time for first home buyers to move in.
Right. Which I've always heard is an issue in Johnson County, is
Yes.
people can afford to live here that work in a lot of the...
It takes a
Right.
two-income family, I
Mhm,
think, really,
mhm.
to start being able to move in and being able to buy and purchase in the area.
How did those declines in real estate value compare to the nation?
Well, if you go to the West Coast or the East Coast, and those are the best barometers that you want to look at, they're seeing 30, 40, 50% drops in value.
In both commercial and residential real estate?
Both.
Mm-hmm.
And Cleveland and Detroit.
Cleveland,
as well.
Detroit,
Right.
you can go to Vegas and Phoenix.
So we're still talking
We're-
less
we
than
are-
half.
I'm just
even in
saying
the
we're
worst
kind of
case
in the
scenario.
ripples.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We're not in the falling off the cliff
Mm-hmm.
that we've seen on the two coastlines. And I have a friend in Fort Myers, and he lost all the value that he's owned for a property for 15 years. So, I
So
mean,
he was not a speculative buyer.
he was not a speculative
Okay.
buyer or anything like that. But I mean, those are the things that are happening
Right.
on the coastlines, and there's such a glut that they're still working through, and then we're having the recession on top. And so they're really in deep, deep trouble in the two coastlines.
And I don't know if you can get to this level, but how do we compare with some of our peers like Omaha, Wichita, Des Moines, St. Louis, forget the coast, other Midwestern regional cities?
I would say Midwest regional will probably all in the same kind of going through bumps. You know, peaks and valleys, but they're shallow. They're not the real high, the real low. We never really got outrageous inflation in home prices, and therefore we're not going to see the big falls. So I think we're kind of still in this wavy time period of it's going down maybe a little bit, but then I think we'll start seeing an uptick.
Based on your professional experience, any idea when you think we might recover those losses of the past couple of years in value?
I think we'll start seeing the bottoming in residential, hopefully this year, or the end of this year and the beginning of next. Commercial is really going to be the unknown that we have, and I think we have a lot of things that are probably going to get ready to be foreclosed on in the next 18 months.
Right.
And part of the problem is back in the 88 to 91 crisis that I kind of consider back when the RTC, we were not flushing out the assets fast enough, and so it's going to be a more prolonged downward trend that will be down for a while. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it, that we're not having that flushing out of the assets, and then we can start rebounding quicker. And then, of course, we talk about population growth, and it's been, our population growth used to be 10 to 12,000. Now we're around 6,000, I believe, is the last number from last year to this. So we need to have that increase in population, which will then help in disposable income being used in the retail industry and then also in the housing market. So I think if we get those items back into place and we get a net flow of population increase, then Johnson County will be poised for the future.
Bill, green shoots, optimism, hearts
I
and
don't know if I
flowers.
had optimism.
You had there. Yeah, we want to make sure we
Green
get
shoot
everybody.
to me is not that we're getting worse at a slower rate.
Okay.
Right?
Exactly.
And a lot of what we've been discussing is that's the kind of green shoot. That indicates how bad things are. I think that the green shoots are, in this area in particular, the health sciences development. That's the most optimistic things going forward. And so again, in terms of a bit of the strategy, that's how you create success. You always build it around the universities in the modern era in the United States whenever you go high tech. You just look around the nation where they have great success with this strategy. It's always based around the universities. So what's the big risk there? Look what's happening to the budget for your state universities. And they're getting just absolutely chopped. Now, your competitors are as well in California to an even greater extent, but that's no joy. Right? We don't get stronger because California gets weaker. It's not how economies work. We try to convince people of this. That when they do well, we do even better. We have more folks we can sell to, those animal products and such, better grades of beef or whatever we manufacture, including garment. So our biggest risks in many ways are not within our control. Right? The local market is everything in terms of housing, but it's a regional and a national market when it comes to commercial real estate, especially for larger buildings. And that's why, even though we never had the same degree of inflation in commercial real estate, we can get a chop at 3 times the residential rate in the commercial real estate. And commercial real estate's going to get considerably worse in this country. The FDIC numbers were that 1.4 trillion needs to be refinanced, and that 50% of those are underwater.
That's national statistics.
That's national, but I'm saying the national matters here.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are well-known effects in economics from inventories that lead to short-term recoveries in recession. So people always talk about those as green shoots. The question is whether you can sustain that short-term inevitable inventory effect. And it isn't inherent. Look at Japan, which used to talk about the lost decade, except now it's 2 lost decades. The Nikkei, their equivalent of the Dow Jones, 20 years later is 25% of its peak value. Or another way is, imagine the Dow Jones lost 75% of its value and stayed that way for 20 years. Right?
Well, there'd be a lot of retirees committing.
We can't fix this in Johnson County or in Kansas City. These are national policies that we need effective stimulus if you want to get any kind of robust recovery. And the stimulus is too small and already on the downside in terms of net flow of funds pretty soon. We have all kinds of things resetting. I know sitting right here in front we've only talked about some of the shoes that are going to drop, commercial real estate. Well, home lending has these reset problems with the various categories of loans. Less true here than in the coasts, but they're happening this year and next year.
You're talking about ARMs?
Yeah, especially option pay ARMs, where, surprise, everybody picked the option of paying at a negative amortization rate, which is fancy jargon for didn't pay enough to pay the interest currently due, which is to say the principal amount of the debt has been growing on all of these folks for typically 5 years. So we're going to have upticks in delinquencies. We're going to have upticks in foreclosure that are going to continue through most of this year and quite possibly next year, even if we get a recovery in average home prices. Both things will be happening at the same time.
Do you think that's the reason why the Federal Reserve is trying to keep the interest rates so low?
Oh, absolutely.
So to allow the resetting of these loans so that people can not be as bad off and going through this cycle, and then also for the commercial so that they can reset. The free flow of money or the very low interest rate is really a policy to just try to get us through the next 2 or 3 years.
It's that, and it's an implicit subsidy to the largest banks and financial institutions who are playing an arbitrage game, where they get to borrow at next to nothing, and then they buy government securities. The national numbers are staggering. The largest banks reduced their lending by over $500 billion. Small banks increased it slightly. The largest banks, those too big to fail, chopped their lending considerably. They're the ones receiving the bailouts. It's disgusting.
Let me just ask a quick question. On a public policy basis, Paul, I mean, you're the closest to government at the table. What are you telling elected officials about what kinds of revenues they can be expecting over the next year or two, and, you know, as far as so they can make planning as to what kinds of service cuts or employee cuts they're going to have to doing? And
I've said between 10 and 11 it's going to be a choppy area. Are we at the bottom, or where we're at, how fast things are going to happen on the commercial side? On the residential side, if the stimulus money is, there's talk about expanding it to the end of the year, which will be a positive thing for us.
Is that the tax credits?
The
for
tax
buyers?
credits.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the tax credits. If those continue, that'll be positive for us. And then we are probably at the very bottom of what I call residential construction at 650 units.
Right.
And so we're probably at that very bottom. It might be another year, but we should start seeing an uptick. And we have a long absorption time of the commercial development and residential developments that are already out there. We have enough vacant lots
Right.
that it'll take several years, many years actually, to absorb those into the marketplace. So a lot of new development will probably not be around. That's kind of, a lot of entities use that as part of their budgeting process. That's kind of new money because it was under agriculture, now it's under developed lots. So we have that issue. So I think they're going to see the next year and 2 years, probably from their perspective, will they see a big increase in the valuation growth? Probably not.
Right.
But what they will see, they'll have to deal with whether they want to raise the mill levy to generate enough revenue, or will there be the talk of what some entities have already done, which is reduction in workforce.
Right. So definitely we're still in some really tight times at the various city halls and county government here.
And I think those will be partly delayed because some stimulus money, I believe at the state level, was used to fund operations. And what I understand about the Kansas government is that their net reserves were going to be $30,000, which is really a rounding error when you look at their when you look at their budget process with the amount of reserves. One of the things that Johnson County's done has been very positive, is that we've built a lot of reserves, and so we're using reserves now to help weather through this particular program or cycle that we're having.
Do you guys have any handle on sales tax revenues? I'm just kind of curious how they've been performing and where they're headed or not headed.
Yes, well, they're down. We track that monthly, actually, in Johnson County. And for the year 2009, we were down close to 8% for the year compared to 2008. Certainly, and that's driven by sales tax. So it's not strictly retail storefront types of purchases. It also includes any business-to-business transactions that are subject to sales tax. But the vast majority are what you think of as traditional retail sales. So, going forward, I think that we need to firm up the footing under the consumer. Consumer spending drives 70% of the economy, and
is that in Johnson County or the nation as a whole?
That's nationally, but I think that's safe to say that that's the case here as well. And with home values declining, which is typically the largest asset a household has, even if you remain employed, and there's been a lot of layoffs, but even those who remain employed and see the housing market deteriorating and the biggest asset they have, eroding in value, that affects how you choose to spend your money, and the savings rate is going up, which long term is a good thing. Short term, in terms of pulling us out of the recession, is probably going to delay that somewhat.
Do you guys ever measure consumer confidence in Johnson County?
We actually
what
measure that monthly.
What is it telling you?
It's telling us that consumers are not very confident in the state of the economy. We survey for consumer confidence here in Johnson County using the same methodology that the Conference Board does nationally, and we've through the recession we've tracked essentially in lockstep. Downward with the.
Do you think I get this all the time from realtors, who complain that people read about the national media and how awful it is in Florida or California, but please, why don't you tell them Kansas City's not bad? You were just saying that our unemployment rate in Johnson County is 4 or 5%, which, I know there are many states that would have loved to have had that even when times were flush. Do you think people here are reacting to national news, or are they really paying attention to what's going on with their neighbors and their own pocketbooks and their own housing values?
Well, I think both. Our consumer confidence is above the level of the nation. We are more confident. We are, in Johnson County, I think, more financially secure in general. And so our consumer confidence reflects that, but we're down significantly from where we were 3 or 4 years ago.
Cheerful bunch here a few years ago.
We were, in fact, yes.
Can I add
Go ahead, jump
an
in.
element on the public finance side that you
Right,
were talking
yeah.
about, which is one of the things I teach. You have to fit this in with what's happening on the commercial real estate, because what's going to explode is tax competition. That takes more time. But my lease is coming up. I don't necessarily have to be in Johnson County in the modern era. I can be elsewhere. I not only look for cheaper rent, I say which state and locality is willing to give me a deal on taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so these circumstances are precisely what prompt greater tax competition. And as for from the government perspective, that's just a pure loss overall. So we're going to lose more revenues than you're anticipating.
Well,
because of the kick-in of that competition.
And believe me, covering development for the paper, this is something I hear about all the time. It's just this incentive issue and states poaching businesses from one side to the other. In the real world, though, gentlemen, maybe, and Bill, go ahead. How often do businesses make decisions about where they locate simply based on the kinds of tax incentives they get from the state or community?
Remember, careful, I'm not saying the opposite.
Oh.
They're going for the lower rent that they can go to Atlanta. Rents are collapsing in Atlanta.
So these are free market activities. Then.
That's
this
right.
is not the state
but
of
if
Georgia
I'm going to go
saying
to
we'll
Atlanta,
give you.
I'm also going to go to the capital and the city and say, hey, I'm thinking of relocating.
Mm-hmm.
What can you do for me?
But their core motive is the fact that they can get cheaper rent.
In that case, yes, but
Mm-hmm.
the two work in the same direction, is my point. And my point is that there's a lag in that occurring.
Mm-hmm.
People's
Right.
tendencies get closer to the end and such. And in addition to this, they start pressuring their landlord 2
Right.
years, 3 years in advance of the end of the lease, saying, Atlanta, have you seen what rents are like in Atlanta? And it's warmer.
But I wonder, Bill, how much of that will be a short-lived situation, because traditionally we are the low-rent metropolitan compared to the Atlantas and the coast of the world. Housing, rent, everything. That's one of our great benefits, is it's very livable here. It's affordable, and you can.
You're absolutely right, but Atlanta also positions itself as a anti-union, relatively lower wage place. And of course, what the deal is, you lock into a 7-year, 8-year, 9-year lease. I mean, that's how you do it in these kinds of negotiations. And it's a win from the standpoint of the new tenant because they've locked in this historically really low rate. But the landlord, as you say, is looking for finally some stability. And the landlord's probably the third landlord because the first two have probably gone bankrupt.
Well, that's interesting. You're raising a point. Do you see our metro being vulnerable to other parts of the country that might be more competitive for whatever reason? I'm getting a little skepticism from you.
Well, traditionally, we do some look at migration patterns and see, and we're a net in-migration metro. We gain more people into Kansas City than we lose to other parts of the area. Interesting, what metropolitan area, I'll throw this to the table, what metropolitan area are we gaining more of our population? What's our greatest inflow metropolitan area in the country? Where are we gaining more people from? Los Angeles. And San Francisco and San Diego are, I think, in the top 10 as well. So to your point, very high cost state, and they're looking for other opportunities. I used to work, I would get some phone calls from folks who were considering relocating to Kansas City, and they'd say, I'm looking for a home in about the $400,000, $500,000 range, and they're coming from California. That's a modest home. I can't even begin to tell them what kind of home that's going to buy them out here. So, that was back in the 90s. Things have changed a little bit since then. But people look to us as a low-cost place. I think you're right. For a period of time, places in the South, particularly, that have been really hit hard. They'll be offering deals to get people to come back in there. And I think, as history has shown, those cities can grow very rapidly and quickly lose that advantage that they had over us.
Vegas and Phoenix, what a mess that is.
Right.
Yeah.
That's going to.
My point from that is, you see, we're the Georgia in that scenario, where we're the low-cost area, and we say, come from L.A., come from San Francisco. Well, those folks make phone calls not just to us, but to Atlanta.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and they can.
But the point
they can
that
choose
maybe
to come to Atlanta
2 or 3 years ago, when Atlanta, or from now, when Atlanta's back hitting on all cylinders, are these guys going to be still competitive? Or
Atlanta will not be hitting on all cylinders. You have to understand how long it takes to recover from one of these things, and frankly, with our experience in Texas, you know, you're talking about 6, 7, 8 years before you get rents that approach what they were.
Let's just, you know, one of the things that we wanted to touch on a little bit is just to remind people Johnson County's importance in this metropolitan economy. Can you guys just kind of at least give us a sense of where we fit in? Just go ahead.
Sure. We do a little pamphlet annually where we look at Johnson County's growth over the previous 10-year period in terms of population, employment, and number of business establishments, and we've been doing this for over 15 years, and the story really hasn't changed, and that is that Johnson County has accounted for over half of the population growth in the 15-county Kansas City MSA, and we've accounted for an even higher percentage of the employment growth. You know, the last iteration that we did just recently showed that we accounted for 62% of the employment growth in that 15-county region. So we are, in terms of growth, we are really the economic engine driving growth.
And how about the state of Kansas? Because I had somebody suggest to me the other day that one of the reasons we're never going to see a peaceful handshake across the state border is the fact that the state of Kansas really relies on Johnson County to bring home the bacon, and has a disproportionately large amount of revenues going to Topeka compared to its population. Is that hearsay, or is there? Can you give some talk?
No, actually, we touch on those things in the same pamphlet. We also compare our growth to the state of Kansas. The numbers are fairly similar to what we mean to the state economy as compared to what we mean to the metro economy. Again, we're accounting for roughly half or more of the population growth in Kansas out of 105 counties. Keep in mind that there are many counties in Kansas that have declining population,
Sure.
but in net total, we're accounting for over half of the state's population growth.
That's a pretty astonishing number.
Over half of the employment growth statewide. In terms of statewide revenue into the state coffers, we account for approximately a quarter of sales tax revenue. So as similar proportion of income tax. Whereas we account for, I think, in the neighborhood of 17-18% of the state's population, we're providing approximately a quarter, 25-26% of state revenue.
And I can't imagine Jackson County having anywhere near that share of Missouri's revenues or importance in population.
We also became the most populous county in the last 3 or 4 years, wasn't it?
Actually, it's longer ago than that. It was early part of the decade. We weren't quite, in terms of population, weren't quite larger than Sedgwick County in the 2000 census, but in 2001 or 2002 we became the largest county in the state. Our current population, the last Census Bureau estimate was 2008. The 2009 estimate should be coming out in the next month or so. But our population at that point was 534,000.
534,000. That's.
If you were to project our growth and estimate what we might be today, we're approaching 550,000.
Really, up from what in 2000?
In 2000, trying to recall now. It seems like it was a decade ago. You'll have to remember.
Sorry, I thought I was the one with memory problems.
I think it was in the 490, 480, 490
Okay,
range.
so we've added at least 150,000 people over the past 10 years to Johnson County.
Not quite that many.
Okay.
About 70,000.
Yeah,
70,000. Sorry, there goes my arithmetic skills. That's why you guys are the economists and I'm the reporter. And so Johnson County's role in helping bring Kansas through the recession. Yeah,
I think we're very important to the state in terms of pulling us out.
On the real estate side, Johnson County represents about a third of the value of the state of Kansas.
A third of the value of the state of Kansas. That's amazing.
Then you take Douglas County, which is, you take Lawrence County, where Lawrence is, Wyandotte County, you take Shawnee and Sedgwick, they're about a third. And then the rest of the state is about a third.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at it from that standpoint, there's 5 counties really pulling the bacon
Right.
for the state.
Right.
On the real estate side,
Mm-hmm.
when you look at real estate.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of agriculture value is very low because we're required by statute to value it on ag use value, not necessarily market value. So if you look at it from that standpoint, you know, Johnson County is the #1 county on the
Definitely.
real estate side. And then the other 4 counties that are a large metro make up a third, and then the remaining 100 counties.
So when Johnson County sneezes, the state definitely catches a cold as far
Right,
as the
and-
economy here.
And I'm not really sure if they were ready for the revaluation that we did this year, because there have always been positive growth, and now we're starting to see some negative growth from Johnson County.
Mm-hmm. Any reflections on the? You've got the big picture at the Mid-America Regional Council, Johnson
Right.
County in our metro. What?
Absolutely, I agree with what Doug said. It's a growth engine for the region.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with him on the job growth. I mean, that's where the jobs are going. Those are the high-paying jobs tend to be going as well. So Johnson County, clearly very important to the health of the region as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And is there anybody even nipping at Johnson County's heels? I hear about Speedway and Cerner and all that great stuff in western Wyandotte County and Nebraska Furniture Mart. Is that just still a?
Well, there are a lot of great things going on throughout the metro, but I think Johnson County has got so much momentum built up over the last 30, 40 years that it's going to continue to be the growth leader for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And who buys the big ticket items at those stores?
Right.
Yes, yes. Well, this has been a great discussion. I don't know if any of you guys have any other parting wisdom on the subject of the temperature of the local economy, but if so, put it out there.
Well, Johnson, I'll state it more aggressively. It is Kansas, along with Lawrence. If you want the future of Kansas economy, what would be nationally and globally competitive? This is Kansas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so will Kansas, as a state, support Johnson County? Will, you know, it's a very good sign in terms of the hospital complexes. That's exactly what needs to be done. And as I said, they need to get rid of the big risk, which is the Kansas legislature mucking about on the health sciences in ways that they scare off those investments and those professionals.
That's a good warning call. That's a great way to finish it up, because that's kind of the way you started it out. Is just you know, Johnson County needs to have that kind of freedom to be able to continue to prosper. I don't know if anybody else has any thought on that. I think we're close to the finish, and so it's been a great conversation, guys, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.